Hello everybody, Pinstripe here. What is going on? Welcome back to the Hogshead podcast. Today on episode 6 we're talking about a bunch of different things and analysing some interesting imagery. And what I mean by that is that one of the dudes in the Hogs of War Discord posted a very interesting image that was from an old Polish magazine, gaming magazine I believe, by the name of Maniac. It was posted back in November 1999, and we're going to be looking at it and analysing it today. I know that podcasts don't usually include any kind of visuals or, that kind of thing, but I just want to do things a bit differently, just so you can see what it is I'm actually talking about, and we can discuss as we always do in the comments. The guy who posted it, who's called John, thank you very much for giving me a topic to focus on. I know that we've talked about the prehistoric version of Hogs of War before. This is, of course, the pre-alpha, and again, we have discussed the stages of development before. So you go from pre-alpha to beta to final release. So pre-alpha is kind of, you've got the groundwork, but nothing really functions very well. But this image that I'm going to show you is it kind of changes all that, and it's in between the alpha and the beta stage where everything's, I guess, functional. The levels are there, the design's there, but the game was going through this complete change, or this complete flip, I suppose, and going into that more modernized style that we know of today. So the image, as you can see, houses 4 different shots. So we're going to start at the top left and make our way down and finish at the bottom right. So starting with the top left, as you can see, there is a pig to the left, a tank to the right, and a familiar building in the middle. I can confirm that the top left image is the map known as Mines. I have showcased that before, we've talked about it before. I can confirm that because the building asset is a factory, I guess, and it's very distinct in its design, and you can just make out a couple of the bridges that have been showcased. That map is actually during the daytime. I did showcase Mines at nighttime. I will show it at daytime as well. I just kind of didn't realize that when I was using the cheat engine, if I plonk an unused map onto the if I swap out a map that is at nighttime, then the unused map will be at nighttime. That's the best way I can put it. So I will showcase it in the daytime, but there is a lot more that we can talk about here, because the big elephant in the room of that part of the image is the tank. That is what's it called? A Saint Chamond, which was a huge French tank that was used during the First World War. We've talked about tanks before and how this early state of development was very much about creating realistic elements, I guess, or realistic assets. So tanks were a major focus point of that. You had the Mark V and Mark VI, which was a British tank. You had the Renault tank, which was a small, compact tank that was good for dealing with infantry. And then you had this humongous beast that was known as the Saint Chamond, which was very slow and had a huge forward-facing gun, which was very prone to getting stuck in trenches because it was so top-heavy. It would kind of topple over, face first in a way, and the gun would end up getting jammed or stuck in the ground. But it is, just another example of how this game was trying to create realistic assets and go along with that sort of realistic war theme, I guess. The other interesting point about this image is the pig. The pig is posed in a slightly different way to what we are normally used to seeing. So his rifle is pointing upwards. He's got his hand, it's not a pose that I'm used to seeing in the game. I don't know about you, but it just looks a bit different. He's also not wearing any kind of helmet, which is unusual for a lot of the pigs in the game. There's usually a hat that accompanies a lot of these pigs, but overall, there's very little uniform going on. The other thing I can confirm is that this was still a stage, I believe, where the other team textures hadn't been made yet. I've discussed it before on how, at this point in the prehistoric pre-alpha stage, only the British team had been made. So only the British textures had been created. So you can see in every single shot that all of the pigs on there are wearing the standard khaki uniforms, or a hint of brown, but I believe that might be one of the legends, but we'll get to that image in a minute. The other interesting point is the top right of that image has, I guess, maybe it's a self-heal. I'm not entirely sure what that item is, but it has a red cross on it, which would mean that it's some kind of healing item or ability. I'm not entirely sure. The other final interesting point regarding that image is the top left, where you can see the pig's face. Now, in the pre-alpha that I've showcased, there is pig faces, but they're not as highly detailed as they are here. And yeah, I believe that those are the more modernized, or the pig faces that were created later on. So those have kind of been chucked in there, and the UI itself for that top left section, the pig faces would have been on the right hand panel, not the left one. So they've swapped that around. But yes, that is the updated version of the map known as Mines, which is awesome to see, because any sort of update or, you know, additional detail that we can see to maps that we've already looked at is always handy, and indeed awesome to see, because we like to see progression both with the levels, the pigs, and indeed the assets that were in the game that we don't get to play with. So the top right image is the one we're moving on to next, which is, I believe, the map known as Fjords, which is the mission known as Glacier Guns, which is a mission that I am kind of on the fence about. It's one that interests me because, you know, it's gone through the updates of having an aqua tank in it, and, you know, obviously it's got plenty of pillboxes, and I will be going through it in terms of map development in, you know, a different video. But you can see in this one that there is a lot going on. For starters, you've got two major explosions, which is the only time I've actually seen any kind of particle effects in the older version. I haven't seen any real particle effects up until the alpha, so seeing them in there is kind of interesting, because it means that the gameplay was actually working in some way, shape or form. They had it working and progressing forward. But you can see on the far side of the map there are two buildings which were in my Keep video for the map development for the map known as Keep, which is Mission 22's Assassination. So if you want to check that video out, you can see them in more detail. But you kind of get the similar assets that are used throughout this version of the game. Yeah, they're kind of placed around different levels. I don't really know why. It was mainly to save space, I guess. You know, you got to reuse assets as much as possible. And those buildings in particular were, you know, snowy themed. They had snow on their roofs, so it made sense to put them over there, I guess. You know, it fits with the theme of the map being all snowy. Which is also interesting because, you know, those high points over there were usually where you would find pillboxes. You can just make one out in the, well, on the far right, and of course there are several pigs that are dotted around, but the main focal point for this image is in fact the vehicle that is shown on the left hand side. Now, we've discussed previously, like, again, everything I'm bringing up in this video we have discussed before, or talked about, or mentioned before. But I believe that is it's currently the only example of, what was it called? It was, I think, a launch. That's what they called it. It was a vehicle that was called a launch. It was a troop transport that operated solely on water. It moved as fast as the amphibious, which was a different troop transport, I think, that you could use on land. I'm not entirely sure, but it could carry up to 3 pigs or a single vehicle, and could be deployed on. It could deploy its cargo onto beachheads, which, as you can see, is kind of what's going on there. I mean, you know, it's not exactly a beach, but it is a landmass that it's landed on. I could be wrong. You know, it could be a gunboat or it could be a destroyer, but it doesn't really have that vibe. It's got that, you know, boxy troop transport look. So that is the only image or time that I have seen an example of that, but that is just my theory. What do you think about these images so far? Do you like the idea of having realistic vehicles? I think it would have been interesting, but I'm glad that they didn't, you know, necessarily go down that route, because I guess you don't get as much stylization with characters and models. If you're restricting yourself to being realistic to real life, then that's a completely different ball game. And then you have people criticizing, oh well, it's not 100% accurate because of X, Y, and Z. Whereas if you go for a more stylized route, you've got the freedom to go ahead and make whatever you want. So I'm kind of 50-50 because, I want to see what these things look like in game, and how they played out, because from what I've read and the information that I've received regarding how gameplay functioned in the older versions, it's completely different in regards to damage, in regards to how vehicles and buildings were used. There's a lot there that we don't quite know yet, and I'm hoping to find out in future. But the other interesting point regarding the top right image is, again, the top right of the top right corner of that screen. I don't really know what that weapon or ability is, but it is green. It looks like a helmet, or I'm not entirely sure. Maybe it's poison gas, maybe it's something. I don't know. Let me know your suggestions in the comments, as always. But we're going to move on to the bottom left, which is an image that looks kind of weird. The best way I can describe it is it's something that I've always thought was possible, but didn't expect to see at all. And what I mean by that is, if you watch the I guess the intro video that showcases that sort of Hogs of War propaganda, and you see two pigs that are sat at an artillery station, I guess, and they're shooting artillery. I always looked at that video and I thought, oh wow, that would be so cool if you could walk up to a piece of artillery and actually see the pig sit down at it and use it in a certain way. Now these pigs are, posed as if they are loading whatever this weapon is. It is a weapon that I've talked about before and showcased. I believe it was just an artillery, but the top right shows that it's actually a mortar. I'm not sure though if that's 100% accurate. It does kind of look like it, but it's a huge mortar, I have to say. It's a big gun, but they're posed in a way as if they're loading shells into it, or just using it. So how that would have been used, I don't know. What the pig on the far right is doing, I also have no idea. Maybe he's instructing them how to shoot it. And it does also raise the question, is everything that is showcased here on all of these images, is all of that 100% accurate? We're going to get to that point a bit later on, but yeah, this one, there isn't much to talk about other than how they're posed. I'm not entirely sure what map this is either, because we can't really make out any of the terrain. I believe there's a bridge right in front of them. I think that's a bridge, but yeah, it's a tricky one. So we're going to move on to the final image, which I believe is Hill Road, because you've got the bridge there, and the overall landscape is very similar to the modern day version of Hill Road. Hill Road didn't change much in regards to its sculpting. It was just kind of cleaned up a bit more and made more modern, but there is a lot going on in the foreground. I think there is a tank over there, maybe something, I don't know. There's definitely a medical tent, which were very active in the old version of the game. We do know that the medics and the surgeons were able to build medical tents and MASH tents as well. So maybe that's an early version of that. But you can see in the top right that is in the arsenal of whatever pig is selected. But obviously the camera in each individual shot is posed in a way that is not representative of the gameplay. So there is no third person view. The camera is posed in the bottom two, it's posed close to whatever pig is right there, and in the top it's kind of a wide shot, whereas the top left is a close-up of obviously the tank and the pig on the left. So a lot of thought has gone into these images, and it's also very strange that these images are taken from a Polish magazine dated after this version of the game was, completed. This was after the point when the game had been completely changed and it didn't look like this anymore. So why was it in that magazine? There are a lot of questions, of course, and I have tried to do some research online. I've tried to do some digging and find whatever magazine this was, but I've had no luck. So as always, Hogs of War raises more questions than answers, but there are some more talking points regarding these images. So I have, of course, briefly touched on the pig faces, which, as you can tell, and as I've said, are the modern day equivalents that you find on the roster screen. But they just kind of make the game feel a bit more individual, in that the pig that you are selecting, that is his face. That's who you are when you're controlling that pig, which is kind of cool, and obviously isn't something that is used in the modern day version of the game. But going back to my original point that I was making before, in that this does raise the question of how accurate are these images. How functional was the gameplay at this point in development. It's also been a focal point that I haven't touched on in regards to gameplay. I've showcased all the maps and stuff, but I haven't shown any gameplay because it's not functional. It's not possible to showcase gameplay when nothing works. There are some animations, a lot of the animations in these early versions were not ready, or they were broken, or at least in the version that I've showcased, those things were not anywhere near ready just yet. And obviously the groundwork was there regarding the maps and the weapons, both on the UI, and what I mean by UI is the user interface. So the things that you see that are showcased, the information that is showcased to you through the use of a HUD, through the use of images that are the weapons that you're selecting, all that kind of stuff. So the UI is the bits and pieces that tell you what is going on, what you're selecting, what you're doing. So everything that's on the HUD, the timer, all of that stuff. But nothing was functional regarding weapons, so I couldn't take out a rifle, and I couldn't shoot the pig next to me because the bullet would just go straight through him. You could walk through your entire team. There was no collision on any of the pigs, so you could basically stack them inside each other and not be able to deal any damage. So the idea of being able to kill individual pigs was not quite ready yet either. And that's a phrase I used a lot recently, but it's true. Just a large proportion of the game itself was not 100%. So this was more laying the groundwork for further builds, because again, going back to the topic of builds and alpha and beta and pre-alpha, it's not just one version of each. You don't get a single version of the alpha and then that's it. That is the alpha. That's it. That's done. No, you get maybe 20 versions of the alpha before you then move on to beta, because with each stage it requires things to be complete in terms of QA testing, in terms of making sure the game is functional, making sure all the bugs are taken care of, making sure that everything functions correctly. So this was like ground zero for the pre-alpha. This was the point in which the game was basically just been born and put into and programmed into a 3D environment. So it's interesting to see stuff like particle effects. That's a big thing, and knowing that I guess grenades or shells were working, and whether or not that was actually functional. And my main aim going forward in future is to try and find or showcase as much as is humanly possible in regards to gameplay for the older versions of things. The alpha is easy because the alpha was when it was functional. The alpha is you guys saw my previous E3 video. That is the alpha. That's when the game has reached the point when it looks more like today's game, whereas these images, that's when Gremlins hadn't been taken over yet completely by Infogrames. It was, this was their version of Hogs of War. This was their thinking of how the game should be. But as we know from what Jacob Hadgood has told us, the game was far too slow and there were just a lot of issues with it. So, yeah, I don't know, we discussed this before, but I just want to reiterate it because it can be kind of confusing, especially for people that don't know the ins and outs of it. And that just makes me sound really big headed, I know, but I'm trying to explain it in a way that makes sense and is interesting as well. If you take a look at the credits for the final version of Hogs of War, you will see a lot of QA testers, and that is because, they're required to continuously play the game and make sure it is bug free. Now, they may have been, hired from the beginning of the project, or maybe it was the programmers such as Jacob who would, as he said before in the Retro Hour podcast, program the game and make builds during the day and then play the game at nighttime. Whether or not that's true, who knows, but usually the way of doing it is that you have QA staff and indeed just personnel on these projects hired from the beginning, from start to end, so from pre-alpha up to final release. But I'm going to try and explain the overall process of how builds work as easily as I possibly can. So picture the scene. It's 1998. Hogs of War has just been thought up by Gremlins. It was possibly inspired by Ian Stewart going to see Babe, who was the creative director at Gremlins at the time. If you want to hear more about those kind of details, then do check out the Retro Hour podcast that had Jacob Habgood on it. It is a good listen, and I did, of course, discuss it in a previous episode of the Hogshead podcast, so check that out if you really want to. But anyway, so it's 1998. The idea of Hogs of War has just been drafted up. Concept art is being made. Overall thoughts on how the game should be in terms of the style is being thought of, and the initial idea, as we can tell from these images, is that they're going for a modern, realistic World War I theme that involves pigs shooting each other. Before any of the programming or any of the 3D modeling or any of the game stuff is started, they obviously have to get the pre-production out of the way. So that involves, as I said, concept art and creating the overall style through the use of drawing and planning and meetings and all that sort of stuff. All the usual things you'd expect to see within the games industry, that is going on. So when we reach the stage of pre-alpha, that is when, the actual game itself is born. That is when the very first version of Hogs of War is created, and that is essentially what these images are, or at least what I've shown it through the unused map videos, the really early ones, where the pigs look terrifying and don't really ring true to what they look like today. So that is the pre-alpha. This is the pre-alpha. The images that you're seeing, that is pre-alpha. And as I said before, pre-alpha is when the groundwork is there, but there is no gameplay, there is no functionality. You can basically just look at things. You can look at the models you created, you can look at the pigs, you can look at the pig models, you can look at the textures, you can look at the weapons, so functionality is not down in terms of gameplay, in terms of animations. You can, barely walk around sometimes. Sometimes even the animations aren't even in there. So you'll have, pig models and T-poses just like zooming around the map. No animations at all. So that is pre-alpha. So when the pre-alpha stage hits, you have obviously the first build. And that build may include the things you're seeing on the screen right now. It may include those items. But you'll have a group of QA testers that will sit down and be like, okay, well, bug number one, there is no functionality whatsoever. Gameplay is not a thing. You can't throw certain items because the animations aren't there yet. Those that big list of issues will then be put to the programmers. They will fix it, and they will create another build of the game that is still technically pre-alpha, or maybe approaching the alpha stage, and it will go back and forth between QA tester and the development team, and it will go back and forth constantly until you have a functional game, and that is when you reach the alpha stage of development. So alpha is when you have functionality down, when the gameplay is near enough sound. There's not huge game breaking bugs in there or anything like that. You can actually play the game through, you can damage pigs, you can shoot things, the animations are fine, or near enough. You may have some small model issues. There is one particular bug that I've noticed in the alpha version, which is if you draw a rifle, you will see the leg of the pig that has drawn the rifle. His leg will like awkwardly spring forward for no apparent reason. That is one of the only bugs I've noticed from the alpha version. So alpha, you've reached a point where everything is functional, everything is good, and you can play it. You're able to sit down and play through the game. At the same time, you'll have other details like maps being created at the same time and changed, and details being added in. So there's this constant fluctuation of design going on, and design changes, and assets being brought in. So so in the pre-alpha we had these like realistic modern tanks, but now we're in the alpha, we've got more stylized tanks that are within the style that we want them to be. We're not going down the realistic route anymore. Let's stop doing that. Let's focus on making these style tanks, and that is what you'll have in the alpha. So I hope you're following me so far, because again, I know it's confusing, but so once you've reached alpha, the continuation between QA and the development team will continue. So they'll continue to find bugs, they'll continue to play through the levels and everything, and they'll continue to pass on that information to the development team so they can fix things and progress the game further. So once you reach the beta stage, that is when the game is 90% complete. So when you reach beta, there will be very little in terms of design changes. So the pigs are completed, the map and the structure of the game is near enough finished. You're just ironing out those small little details that need to be fixed. So a good example from the beta I can give in regards to a bug is when you're on the map screen progressing from one level to another, the arrow that points from the mission you've just completed to the next one, it overlaps the flag it's meant to be pointing at. So really small little bugs like that would be picked up and fixed. But you have to bear in mind that when you go from each stage of development, so from pre-alpha to alpha to alpha to beta, and then beta to final release, there is a constant build creation. So if we go back to pre-alpha, like I said, when the game is born and there's that talk between QA and the development team, you've got the very first build of the game, right? And that will be labeled as 0.1. So when bugs are found, they're put back to the development team, those bugs are fixed, and the next build is created, and that would be build 0.2. So they'll reach a point when the game is functional enough to be labeled as alpha, and that will be alpha build 1.1, or however many builds it takes. Usually it goes in 0. whatever, or just it goes in decimal points and going upwards. And obviously it just depends on how long it takes for bugs to be fixed, and how long it would require the development team to be working on certain things. So again, this is only speaking from my own experience, and things would have been different back then, so it's not 100% accurate, but as a QA tester, that's pretty much how things work. So you continuously go through all of these builds, and each stage is only labeled as that stage because of its functionality, because of all of these different elements. Most of the time it's only done by word of mouth that it's labeled as alpha and beta. Sometimes you will get all of these builds put together or they're usually kept or housed in the same place, so you'll have all the builds kept in one folder and you'll label that as alpha, and then the next folder will be beta, that kind of thing. I'm going off tangent here, but overall that is the very quick synopsis of how builds work in the games industry. Again, it differs from company to company, but overall that is the way I know it to be. So I hope you guys enjoy this podcast. I went off topic a little bit, but I wanted to explain things in more detail that I haven't before in previous videos. I hope you enjoyed this analysis of the build of the game and indeed this image that we have been talking about. Thank you, John Hogg, for posting it, because you gave me some good talking points and just to clear things up in regards to what is happening in those images. But of course, if you have any other questions or queries and whatnot, let me know in the comments below. I'm going to rest my voice now because it's been half an hour of talking, which is good. I'm looking to increase the length of these podcasts as much as possible. Please do check out the other podcast episodes as well. Plenty of info to take in there, where I've discussed other things like, as I said, the Jacob Habgood podcast, which is episode number 3. I've talked about vehicles, I've talked about the builds, and there's still plenty to talk about in future. But in the meantime, I will catch you guys later for the next one. Check out everything if you can. Peace out, everybody. I need a drink. A drink of water. Water is good for you. Drink water, guys. That's my advice for you for today. Drink water. See you guys later.
Destination